Imagine for just a second that you're freezing cold in a way that goes far beyond the simple inconvenience of forgetting your winter jacket at home. We're talking about a bone-deep, existential freeze that settles into your very marrow and stays there for 6 long, dark months of the year. You're eating potatoes again for dinner, maybe with some herring if you're feeling particularly spicy or adventurous that evening. Your entire country is essentially nothing more than a long, jagged strip of granite and ice that somehow managed to cling desperately to the top of Europe, defying gravity and good sense. Your neighbors to the south, those Swedes, they seem to have everything figured out. They're relatively wealthy, with proper cars, established industries, and a sense of sophistication that makes you feel like the awkward cousin at family gatherings. Meanwhile, you have 3 main economic pillars holding up your entire national existence: fish that you pull from the freezing ocean, trees that you cut down in the endless forests, and a deeply ingrained, pervasive sense of national inferiority that seems to follow you wherever you go. Now, I want you to snap your fingers and imagine a completely different scenario. Today, in this same country, the moment you take your very first breath as a newborn baby, you are instantly worth over $250,000 on paper. Not because your parents are wealthy, not because you've inherited some family fortune, but simply because you were lucky enough to be born Norwegian. Your nation owns more stocks, bonds, and international real estate than most people can even begin to comprehend. You have effectively won the ultimate lottery of life, becoming a trust fund baby on a massive national scale. This isn't some fairy tale or economic fantasy. This is the absolutely true story of how a nation of hard-working fishermen stumbled upon the greatest treasure chest in all of human history, and then, in a move that shocked economists worldwide, decided not to blow it all on luxuries, corruption, and short-term political gains. This is the remarkable story of Norway, and it begins with a fundamental lie about being the poor man of Scandinavia. Let's rewind the clock and dispel a persistent myth that you'll hear repeated constantly. People often say that Norway was essentially a third-world country before oil was discovered. That's not entirely accurate or fair. They weren't experiencing dirt-poor conditions in the way we think about extreme poverty in developing nations today, but they were definitely, unquestionably, the poor cousin of Scandinavia, always looking enviously at their more prosperous neighbors. Picture yourself sitting in a dimly lit pub in Oslo back in 1955. The atmosphere is austere, almost oppressive in its seriousness. The government is completely obsessed with post-war reconstruction efforts, trying to rebuild the nation after the devastating effects of World War II and Nazi occupation. They were so focused on careful resource management that they were actually rationing cars. Yes, you heard that correctly. You needed a special government permit just to buy a car, and this system remained in place until 1960. Luxury was considered a dirty word, something almost morally suspect. The entire Norwegian economy was built on 3 fundamental pillars, 3 industries that defined the nation's economic identity. First, cutting down the endless forests of pine and spruce trees that covered the mountainous landscape. Second, digging valuable minerals and rocks out of the ground through back-breaking mining operations. And third, throwing fishing nets into the freezing, dangerous waters of the North Atlantic to catch cod, herring, and whatever else they could pull from the sea. It was hard, dangerous, physically demanding work that required incredible toughness and resilience. But here's where the dark humor of history really kicks in, creating one of the most ironic moments in the entire story of economic development. In 1958, the Geological Survey of Norway, staffed by the supposed experts in the field, the scientists with impressive PhDs and years of experience swinging rock hammers, wrote an official letter to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They declared, with absolute scientific confidence, and I quote directly from the official document, "One can ignore the possibility that there should be coal, oil, or sulfur on the continental shelf along the Norwegian coast." Let that statement sink in for a moment. That represents the geological equivalent of the guy at Decca Records rejecting the Beatles because he thought guitar groups were on their way out of popular music. It's quite possibly the worst professional scientific prediction in the entire history of economic development. These were the people who were supposed to know what they were talking about, the ones with the advanced degrees and government positions. At this time in history, Norway looked at the North Sea and saw only one thing: trouble. It wasn't a source of potential wealth or opportunity. It was a stormy, dark, violent stretch of water that regularly swallowed ships and sailors without mercy. It was considered a graveyard for vessels and men, not a potential bank vault waiting to be opened. The very idea that this hostile body of water could contain unimaginable wealth seemed laughable to the experts. But while the Norwegians were eating their simple meals of potatoes and herring and trusting their geological experts completely, something absolutely crucial was happening down south that would change everything. In 1959, Dutch engineers discovered the Groningen gas field. It wasn't just a modest find, it was absolutely massive, representing the largest natural gas field anywhere in Europe. And here's the critical insight that would change Norwegian history forever. Geology doesn't care about national borders or political boundaries. If there was natural gas sitting under the Netherlands, and the rock formations clearly stretched northward across the seabed, basic geological logic dictated that there might be something valuable under that angry, storm-tossed Norwegian Ocean as well. Enter the sharks, circling with the smell of potential oil money in the water. In the early 1960s, international oil companies, the massive American giants like Phillips Petroleum and Esso, started sniffing around Norway like wolves eyeing a sheep that doesn't realize it's sitting on top of a gold mine. These were sophisticated, experienced corporations that had made fortunes extracting oil from places like Texas, Oklahoma, and the Middle East. They came to the Norwegian government with what they considered a very reasonable, generous proposal. "Hey," they said, with the casual confidence of companies used to getting their way, "we'll take the exclusive rights to explore your entire ocean floor. We'll pay you a small fee for the privilege, and we'll keep all the oil we find. Deal?" They genuinely thought they were dealing with unsophisticated country bumpkins who would be grateful for any attention from big American corporations. They assumed they could buy the rights to the entire Norwegian continental shelf for roughly the price of a used car. But they made a crucial miscalculation. They forgot one fundamental truth about Norwegians. They might have been poor, but they were definitely not stupid. And they possessed a secret weapon that the oil companies hadn't counted on. A brilliant lawyer named Jens Evensen, whose name you absolutely need to remember because he changed the course of Norwegian history with a single bold legal maneuver. Jens wasn't a geologist or an oil industry expert. He was a bureaucrat, a government lawyer who understood international law better than most people understood their own neighborhoods. When the oil companies came knocking with their arrogant proposals, he realized something crucial that would save Norway's economic future. The international laws regarding who actually owned the ocean floor were surprisingly fuzzy, full of gray areas and unclear boundaries that left room for interpretation. So he made a move that was equal parts brilliant and audacious. He simply declared, unilaterally and without asking anyone's permission, that Norway owned everything on their side of the North Sea. He drew an imaginary line down the middle of the ocean and announced to the world, "Everything on this side belongs to Norway. Period." It was a bold, almost gangster-like move that required incredible confidence and legal sophistication. And because nobody really knew whether there was actually any oil under those freezing waters, the rest of the world just shrugged their shoulders and said, "Sure, Jens, whatever makes you happy. Enjoy your wet rocks and cold fish." They figured it was harmless to let the Norwegians claim sovereignty over what appeared to be an empty, worthless stretch of ocean. This legal masterstroke set the stage for everything that followed. You now had a rigid, slightly socialist, extremely austere Norwegian government that owned the rights to explore their ocean. You had arrogant American oil companies that were used to getting their way, but now had to play by Norwegian rules. And you had a freezing, hostile body of water that the local geological experts absolutely swore was completely empty of any valuable resources. For the next few years, it genuinely looked like the Norwegian experts had been right all along. The oil companies drilled exploratory holes with expensive equipment and experienced crews. They found nothing but seawater and disappointment. They drilled again in different locations, using different techniques. Still nothing. Dry well after dry well, with millions of dollars being essentially set on fire with each failed attempt. The mood among the oil companies became increasingly grim as expenses mounted and results remained non-existent. By the summer of 1969, the major oil companies were completely done with the Norwegian experiment. They were literally packing up their expensive equipment, preparing to abandon the North Sea forever. The Norwegian oil dream appeared to be dead before it had even properly started, but as the old saying goes, it's always darkest just before the dawn. Or in this specific case, it's always most expensive and discouraging just before you hit the ultimate jackpot. Let's set the scene for what would become known as the Christmas Miracle. It's late 1969, and the chaotic 60s are finally coming to an end. The Beatles are in the process of breaking up, ending one of the most influential bands in music history. The United States has just successfully put a man on the moon, achieving what many thought was impossible. And in the North Sea, everyone involved in oil exploration is absolutely miserable. Phillips Petroleum, the American company that had been leading the exploration efforts, had drilled 37 separate holes in the ocean floor. 37 expensive, time-consuming, hope-crushing failures. Do you have any idea how much money that represents in 1969 dollars? It was a complete financial bloodbath, millions upon millions of dollars disappearing into the ocean with nothing to show for it. The executives at Phillips Petroleum went to the Norwegian government and delivered what they thought would be their final message. We're out. We're officially breaking our exploration contract and leaving Norway forever. This has been a complete waste of time and money. But the Norwegian government lawyers looked carefully at the contract and pointed to a specific clause that Phillips had apparently forgotten about. The contract basically stated, if you abandon the exploration before completing your committed drilling program, you have to pay a massive penalty fee to the Norwegian state. Phillips Petroleum did the math and realized something incredible. It was actually cheaper to drill one final hole, a hole they absolutely knew would be empty and worthless, than to pay the penalty fee for quitting early. Think about the level of corporate apathy and resignation here. They weren't drilling because they believed they would find oil. They were drilling purely out of spite, contractual obligation, and financial calculation. They sent their drilling rig, the Ocean Viking, to a location called Block 24. The crew on the rig definitely didn't want to be there. It was December, and the North Sea in December represents hell on earth for anyone working offshore. Picture 50-foot waves crashing over the drilling platform, freezing sleet cutting through any protective clothing, and darkness covering the ocean for 20 hours each day. The crew just wanted to finish this final, pointless hole and go home to their families for Christmas. They started drilling with no expectations and even less enthusiasm. Then suddenly, without warning, the pressure gauges started spiking dramatically. The mudloggers, the technical specialists who monitor what comes up from deep in the earth, noticed something unusual in the samples. On December 23rd, literally the day before Christmas Eve, they pulled up a test sample that changed Norwegian history forever. It wasn't dry rock. It wasn't just a small trace of oil that might indicate larger deposits nearby. It was a monster discovery, a massive oil field that would be named Ekofisk. They had punched a hole straight into what remains to this day one of the largest offshore oil reservoirs ever discovered anywhere in the world. We're talking about billions and billions of barrels of high-quality crude oil. Now imagine you're a Norwegian politician waking up on Christmas morning of 1969. You have your coffee, maybe open a present with your family, and then you receive a phone call that completely changes your understanding of your nation's future. Someone on the other end tells you that your country, which has been scraping by on timber sales and fish exports for centuries, is now effectively sitting on top of a geyser of liquid cash that could transform Norway forever. The scale of the Ekofisk discovery was genuinely terrifying in its implications. This wasn't just good news that politicians could celebrate. It represented a massive tsunami of economic opportunities and potential disasters that could destroy the country if handled incorrectly. Most nations around the world, when they discover this much oil wealth, panic in exactly the wrong direction. They see dollar signs dancing in front of their eyes. Politicians start buying luxury yachts and building golden palaces. Military leaders start purchasing expensive tanks and weapon systems. The national currency spikes dramatically, killing all other industries through what economists call Dutch disease. It's called the resource curse, and it's devastatingly real. Look at Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. Look at Nigeria's decades of corruption and economic mismanagement. Look at countless other nations where finding oil turned out to be the worst thing that could happen to a developing democracy. Oil wealth breeds corruption, laziness, political violence, and eventual economic collapse when the resources run out or global prices fall. Norway stood precariously on the edge of this same cliff in 1970. They held the winning lottery ticket in their hands, but they also had a loaded gun pointed at their economic future. If they let the American companies extract all the oil on American terms and conditions, Norway would receive small royalty payments while Texas oil executives got rich. But if they tried to nationalize everything too quickly, without the technical knowledge to drill safely and efficiently, they could destroy the oil fields through incompetence and lose everything. This is where Norwegian character and political culture made all the difference. Instead of making emotional decisions based on greed or fear, they did something that shocked international observers. They got together in rooms full of economists, engineers, lawyers, and policy experts, and they planned. They planned extensively, carefully, and systematically. They asked fundamental questions that most oil-rich nations never bother to consider. How do we extract maximum value from this resource while maintaining our democratic institutions? How do we avoid the corruption that destroys most oil economies? How do we ensure that this wealth benefits all Norwegians, not just the political elite? How do we prevent the oil industry from destroying our other economic sectors? How do we save money for future generations instead of spending it all on ourselves? The first critical decision they made was about ownership and control. They told the American oil companies, in very polite but absolutely firm terms, "You can participate in developing our oil fields, but you will work for us, not the other way around. We own this resource, and we will decide how it gets developed." This wasn't just national pride talking. It was smart economics that would pay dividends for decades. They created Statoil, a Norwegian national oil company, but they did something brilliant that most state-owned companies never do. They insisted that Statoil learn everything from the American companies. Norwegian engineers worked side by side with experienced Texan drilling experts. They absorbed technical knowledge like sponges. They learned geology, drilling techniques, refinery operations, and international oil trading. Within 20 years, Norway had developed its own world-class oil industry expertise. The second critical decision involved money management and fiscal discipline. Instead of spending oil revenues immediately on popular government programs or prestigious construction projects, they created something unprecedented in human history: a sovereign wealth fund designed to save oil money for the future. But this wasn't just any investment fund. This was a systematically planned, professionally managed financial institution that would become the largest investment fund anywhere in the world. They established a simple but revolutionary rule. Only 4% of the oil fund's total value could be spent by the government each year. That means 96% of all oil profits get invested in international stocks, bonds, and real estate rather than being spent on current government operations. This might sound like a small technical detail, but it represents one of the most important economic policy decisions in modern history. Think about what this rule actually means in practice. Even when oil prices spike dramatically and billions of extra dollars flow into government accounts, Norwegian politicians can't spend that money. Even when there are economic recessions and pressure to increase government spending, they're limited to that 4% rule. Even when citizens demand more social programs or tax cuts, the fundamental discipline remains in place. The third critical decision involved trust and transparency. In most countries, if the government announced they were going to put all the oil money in a special fund and not touch it for decades, citizens would riot in the streets. They would assume, probably correctly, that corrupt politicians were planning to steal the money for themselves. The citizens would demand immediate tax cuts or spending increases, arguing that the money belongs to them right now. But Norway built something remarkable: a political culture where citizens actually trust their government not to steal from them, and the government trusts independent financial experts to manage the money professionally. This isn't just about having good politicians, though that certainly helps. It's about institutional frameworks, transparency requirements, and cultural expectations that make corruption both difficult and socially unacceptable. The Sovereign Wealth Fund publishes detailed annual reports showing exactly where every dollar is invested. Citizens can read about which companies the fund owns stock in, which countries receive Norwegian investment, and how much money gets earned or lost each year. The fund management operates independently from political pressure, making investment decisions based on financial analysis rather than political considerations. This combination of long-term thinking, technical competence, and institutional trust created a virtuous cycle that accelerated Norwegian development. As oil revenues flowed into the sovereign wealth fund, Norway invested that money in thousands of companies around the world. They bought stock in Apple, Google, Microsoft, and hundreds of other successful corporations. They purchased real estate in major cities from New York to London to Tokyo. They invested in government bonds from stable countries, diversifying their wealth far beyond just oil. But here's the really smart part of their strategy. They didn't just invest passively like most pension funds or university endowments. They became what financial experts call activist investors, using their massive economic influence to promote better business practices, environmental sustainability, and ethical corporate behavior around the world. The Norwegian funds started voting their shares in corporate elections, demanding that companies disclose environmental impact data, improve worker safety standards, and stop doing business with dictatorships or human rights violators. When Norway decides to sell their stock in a company for ethical reasons, it sends shockwaves through international financial markets. Other investors pay attention and often follow Norwegian leadership. By the time we reach the present day, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has grown to an almost incomprehensible size, approximately $1.7 trillion. To put that number in perspective that regular people can understand, that's roughly equivalent to the entire gross domestic product of countries like Canada or Spain. It's more money than most people can even imagine, spread across investments in over 9,000 companies operating in 70 different countries around the world. Every single Norwegian citizen, from newborn babies to elderly grandparents, theoretically owns about $320,000 worth of this fund. That means a typical Norwegian family of four has over $1 million in collective ownership of international stocks, bonds, and real estate investments. They are, quite literally, the wealthiest nation on Earth on a per capita basis, and it's not even close to being competitive. But here's where the story gets fascinating and morally complicated. Norway has developed what can only be described as a massive case of economic cognitive dissonance. On one hand, they have positioned themselves as global leaders in environmental sustainability and climate change activism. Norwegian cities are filled with electric vehicles. They have more Tesla cars per capita than any other country, including the United States where Tesla is manufactured. They power their homes almost exclusively with clean hydroelectric energy, generated by massive dams built into their mountainous landscape. They recycle virtually everything, from plastic bottles to electronic waste. They lecture the entire world at United Nations climate summits about the urgent need for sustainability and reduced carbon emissions. Their politicians give passionate speeches about saving the planet for future generations. But here's the contradiction that creates what economists call the green paradox. Where exactly did the money for all those Tesla cars come from? Where did the subsidies for wind farms and solar panels originate? Where did Norway get the financial resources to become a global environmental leader? The uncomfortable answer is that all of that green technology and environmental consciousness was funded by pumping massive amounts of carbon dioxide-producing fossil fuels and selling them to other countries around the world. Norway is essentially operating like a sophisticated drug dealer who doesn't get high on their own supply. They extract oil and natural gas from their offshore fields, refine it into gasoline and heating fuel, and then sell those products to Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and other European countries. They take the cash from those sales, go home to Norway, eat organic salads, and drive electric cars while feeling morally superior to the customers they just sold fossil fuels to. This represents one of the most sophisticated examples of not-in-my-backyard environmentalism in human history. Norway gets to maintain a clean conscience and a clean environment within their own borders, while profiting enormously from the environmental destruction caused by burning the fossil fuels they export to their neighbors. The Norwegian government is completely aware of this massive source of moral contradiction. It creates enormous political tension and genuine soul-searching among Norwegian citizens who care about environmental issues. There's a huge ongoing debate throughout Norwegian society right now. Should the country stop drilling for oil entirely? Should they shut down the offshore platforms that fund their entire social system? The environmentalist political parties argue passionately. Yes, we are complete hypocrites. We're directly profiting from the destruction of the planet's climate. We should immediately shut off the oil taps and find other ways to fund our government. But the mainstream economic and political parties, including both labor and conservative politicians, respond with a much more pragmatic argument. Hold on, they say. If Norway stops selling natural gas to Europe, who exactly is going to fill that massive supply gap? The answer is probably Russia, Qatar, or increased coal burning. Isn't it better that European countries buy democratically produced, relatively clean natural gas from Norway, rather than buying dictator gas from Vladimir Putin's authoritarian regime? This argument gained massive political weight and international support after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Suddenly, Norway wasn't just an oil merchant operating in a moral gray area. They were repositioned as the savior of Europe's energy security and independence. As Russian gas pipelines were shut down due to international sanctions, Norway cranked their production to maximum levels to help European allies. They made absolutely obscene amounts of money during this period. Economic estimates suggest that Norway earned more oil and gas revenue in 2022 alone than in several previous years combined. Some critics labeled them war profiteers, suggesting they were taking advantage of Ukrainian suffering to maximize their petroleum profits. The Polish Prime Minister even publicly suggested that Norway should share their excess wartime profits with other European countries to help with refugee costs and military aid. Norway politely declined to share their windfall profits, but the moral guilt and international criticism clearly remains a sensitive political issue. To help address this ethical discomfort, the Sovereign Wealth Fund has evolved into something unprecedented. An activist investor with a comprehensive ethics council that makes moral judgments about where Norwegian money can and cannot be invested. This ethics council is staffed by philosophers, lawyers, environmental experts, and human rights activists who spend their time deciding which companies and countries are too morally compromised to deserve Norwegian investment. They don't just care about maximizing financial returns. They actively care about promoting what they consider ethical business practices and social responsibility. If a company manufactures nuclear weapons, they get banned from receiving Norwegian investment. If a company produces tobacco products that cause cancer, banned. If a company uses child labor in their supply chains, banned. If a company causes severe environmental damage through their operations, banned. The Ethics Council has blacklisted major corporations like Walmart for labor rights violations, Boeing for nuclear weapons production, and huge mining conglomerates for environmental destruction. When Norway decides to ban a company from their investment portfolio, it sends shockwaves through international financial markets. It's not just about the money, although losing access to a multi-billion-dollar investor definitely hurts companies financially. It's about the reputational damage and the signal it sends to other international investors. It's like being kicked out of an exclusive country club. Other members start wondering what you did wrong. So you end up with this absolutely fascinating dual personality within Norwegian economic policy. On one side, they're operating massive offshore drilling platforms, extracting millions of barrels of oil and cubic feet of natural gas, pumping fossil fuels that contribute to global climate change. On the other side, they're using the profits from those fossil fuel sales to pressure global companies to adopt cleaner, more ethical business practices and invest in renewable energy technology. Is this approach hypocritical? Absolutely, without question. Is it effective at promoting positive change? Surprisingly, yes. It actually works quite well. Norway has discovered a unique way to use the proceeds of the old economy, oil and gas extraction, to buy the financial influence necessary to help build the new economy focused on technology, renewable energy, and sustainable business practices. There's an old saying that captures one of the fundamental patterns of human history. Hard times create strong people. Strong people create good times. Good times create weak people. Weak people create hard times. Norway is currently deep into the good times create weak people phase of this cycle, and the warning signs are becoming increasingly visible to anyone paying attention to Norwegian society and work culture. When you have a social safety net that's essentially made of solid gold and diamonds, The fundamental fear of economic failure starts to disappear from people's lives. And without that fear of falling, sometimes the basic drive to work hard and take risks disappears as well. This is creating what Norwegian social scientists and economists are calling the lazy Norwegian problem. And the statistical evidence is genuinely shocking. Here's a statistic that will blow your mind. Norway currently has one of the highest rates of sickness absence from work anywhere in the developed world. Now, you might initially think, oh, surely that harsh Arctic climate must make everyone sick with flu and other illnesses. But that explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Sweden and Finland experience essentially the same weather patterns, with equally cold winters and similar living conditions, but their sick leave rates are significantly lower than Norway's. The difference isn't the weather or the climate. The difference is the economic incentives built into the Norwegian social welfare system. In Norway, if you call in sick to work, you receive 100% of your regular salary from day one, and this full pay continues for up to an entire year. There is literally no financial penalty for not working. In fact, the social welfare system has become so comprehensive and generous that there's actually a slang verb that is developed in the Norwegian language, to nav. NAV stands for the Norwegian Labor and Welfare Administration, the government agency that distributes unemployment benefits, disability payments, and other social support. To nav means to live entirely off government benefits instead of working a regular job. You'll actually hear Norwegian teenagers joke with each other, saying things like, "I don't want to study hard in school or learn a trade. I'm just going to nav for a few years and live off the government." This represents a complete nightmare scenario for the older generation of Norwegians, the ones who remember eating simple meals of herring and potatoes, the ones who built their national wealth through hard physical labor in fishing boats, logging operations, and mining sites. They look at the younger generation and see a softness, a comfort level that worries them deeply. They see people who have forgotten what real struggle feels like and who take their incredible prosperity completely for granted. The oil industry itself has created additional problems for Norwegian economic diversity and innovation. Because petroleum work pays so incredibly well, it sucks talented people out of every other economic sector. Why would a smart young person choose to become a teacher, a nurse, a small business entrepreneur, or a technology innovator when they can become an assistant petroleum engineer and earn over $100,000 per year straight out of college? This brain drain effect kills innovation and economic diversification. Norway produces very few unicorn startup companies compared to Sweden, despite having significantly more financial resources available for investment. Sweden, with a more diversified economy, gave the world companies like Spotify, IKEA, Skype, and Minecraft. Norway gave the world oil revenue and a pretty good web browser called Opera, but mostly just oil revenue. The long-term fear among Norwegian economists and policy experts is that when the oil eventually runs out, and it will definitely run out eventually, Norway could be left with a population that has completely forgotten how to hustle, compete, and create economic value through innovation and hard work. They worry about becoming a nation of trust fund kids who don't know how to change a tire when their fancy car breaks down. But to their credit, Norwegians are genuinely aware of this potential problem, and they're constantly debating and tweaking their policies to try to find the right balance. The ongoing political debate in Norway isn't just about how to spend oil money. It's about fundamental questions of work ethic, personal responsibility, and social values. They're trying to figure out how to take care of people without completely spoiling them, how to provide security without eliminating the drive to achieve and contribute. So what have we learned from this incredible Norwegian story? How did a frozen strip of granite somehow become the richest nation anywhere on Earth? It wasn't purely luck, although discovering the oil was certainly a lucky break that changed everything. That was definitely their winning lottery ticket moment. But here's the crucial insight. Look at lottery winners in any country, including the United States. Statistical studies show that roughly 70% of lottery winners go completely broke within just a few years of winning. They buy the mansion, the sports cars, the expensive jewelry. They get addicted to luxury lifestyles or destructive habits. They make terrible investment decisions or get scammed by fake financial advisors. And they lose absolutely everything, often ending up in worse financial condition than before they won. Norway won the geological lottery, but they definitely didn't act like typical lottery winners. Instead, they acted like paranoid accountants who had read every cautionary tale about sudden wealth. They got rich and stayed rich because of three specific, deliberate decisions that required incredible discipline and long-term thinking. First, sovereignty. They had the political courage and legal sophistication to tell the big American oil companies, "We own these resources and you're going to work for us on our terms, not the other way around." This wasn't just national pride or anti-American sentiment. It was smart economics that ensured Norway would capture the maximum value from their natural resources. Second, discipline. They made the incredibly difficult decision to refuse to spend oil money on themselves in the present, instead saving it systematically for people who haven't even been born yet. This goes against every natural human impulse and political incentive, but it's the foundation of their long-term wealth. Third, trust. They built institutional systems where ordinary citizens trust their government not to steal public money, and the government trusts independent experts to manage investments professionally, rather than making decisions based on political considerations. That combination of sovereignty, discipline, and institutional trust represents the secret sauce of Norwegian success. It's not actually about the oil reserves sitting under their ocean floor. It's about the character and cultural values embedded in their political institutions and social expectations. The fundamental lesson of Norway isn't about geology or natural resources. It's about national character and the importance of long-term thinking. Norway teaches us that the greatest resource any nation can possess isn't buried underground in oil fields or mineral deposits. The greatest resource is buried in the minds, values, and cultural institutions of the people themselves. Norway became wealthy and stayed wealthy because they understood that the oil doesn't belong to them personally. It belongs to the entire history of their nation, past, present, and future generations. They see themselves as temporary guardians of a resource that should benefit all Norwegians throughout time, not just the politicians and citizens who happen to be alive when the oil gets extracted. And as long as they remember that fundamental principle, as long as they don't get too lazy, too soft, too greedy, or too comfortable with their success, they will probably remain the kings and queens of the North for generations to come. But hey, if they ever do decide to blow it all on massive parties and luxury spending, I really hope they invite the rest of us to join the celebration.